Welcome to Train Signal. This is part 2 of the Protecting Windows 7 lesson in the Windows 7 Administration Training course. In this lesson, we'll cover the local aspects of Windows 7 security, starting with how you configure user account control in Windows 7 for maximum security and flexibility. We'll talk about how you can configure removable device policies to help protect information in your organization. Windows 7 comes with a utility called the Credential Manager, which is what we'll discuss next. Being able to run programs under the specific context of a specific user can be a powerful tool that's accomplished via the run as command, which we'll talk about in this lesson. From there, we'll move on to Windows 7 account policies and user rights and Windows 7 local groups. You'll then learn how to create a password reset disk for machines that are not joined to a domain. We'll wrap up with a discussion about smart card policies in Windows 7. When last we met, we were talking about the networking side of protecting Windows 7 and what that has to do with helping Global Mantic to recover from what was a serious and very public security incident. By way of recap, let's discuss where Global Mantic is again. Remember that Global Mantic is a pharmaceutical company that has a lot of customer contact, and they fall under various privacy regulations that include HIPAA. They have to be very careful with customer information, particularly since they don't want to have a repeat of what caused them so much PR grief the last time around. Global Mantic wants to make sure that every possible security measure is implemented. That includes firewalls, carefully configured remote management capabilities, which we discussed in part 1 of this lesson, and user account control and other various authentication and authorization features, which we'll discuss in this part of the lesson. Global Mantic understands that it's important to balance security and usability so that users can do their jobs while the company remains protected. Next up is user account control, which Global Mantic will be using pretty heavily. Although user account control can be disabled, Global Mantic will not disable this powerful security capability that was first added in Windows Vista. UAC adds an authorization layer before actions requiring administrative rights can be performed. This can include things like installing software or changing particular Windows settings. If this prompt is ignored for more than 150 seconds, the request is not approved. In other words, it's just like saying, no, I'm not going to allow this to take place. Only those users that have been granted administrative rights are allowed to approve UAC prompts. So if you're just a standard user without administrative rights on a machine, you're not going to be able to authorize anything that would require administrative rights anyway. By default, user account control is enabled in Windows 7, and the settings can be configured to meet organizational security policies and need. There are some features of user account control that I think are pretty compelling to make sure that it stays in place. I really am a big believer in user account control. I think that it can reduce the amount of things like spyware that we have on machines and organizations, and for that reason, Global Mantic will be using user account control as well. Now, one question you may have asked yourself is, have you ever wondered why user account control basically locks the desktop? You know, when you get when you do something that requires authorization, it basically grays out the desktop or dims it out, and the only thing you can do is either just respond yes or no to the UAC prompt. This is a good thing. It's by design, and I've seen a lot of forums where people complain about that. They're like, well, it locks up my whole desktop. It takes time for that thing to lock my desktop and then tell me, hey, I want to do this. Am I allowed? That is a good thing. The reason is because this makes it impossible for spyware to pretend that it's a UAC prompt. A lot of times when you go out to websites these days, you're going to see things that look just like a Windows screen. And a lot of people fall for the trap, and they end up with horrible spyware on their machines. By using this feature, which is what Microsoft calls Secure Desktop, it dims out the desktop so you know for a fact that you're responding only to the UAC prompt and not to some other thing that some piece of spyware is trying to do. Now make sure you understand some rights. All users operate with standard privileges all the time, including administrators. Only when a task requiring administrative rights is performed does UAC interject itself and temporarily escalate privileges so that that task can be performed. In most cases, UAC prompts for consent, saying, hey, am I allowed to do this? But if it's not able to do that, it will prompt for credentials and say, give me the credentials for a user that is allowed to perform this function, like installing this piece of software. There are a number of different settings related to user account control in Windows 7, including Never Notify Me, Notify Me only when programs try to make changes to my computer, or Do Not Dim My Desktop, or the default, which is to notify me when programs try to make changes to my computer, but don't notify me when I make changes to Windows settings, or Always Notify Me. A lot of people were annoyed with Windows Vista and its inability to be very granular in user account control. Windows 7 does add some additional features that make it a lot more granular and more friendly for organizations. I highly recommend that you never change the default. Notify me only when programs try to make changes to my computers, or Always Notify, one of these two settings. I find this one useless because this is going to potentially allow spyware to be installed on my machine by trying to fake me out. And this is the worst possible thing you can do, which is to never notify me. Although user account control can be annoying, it's a critical security step to help protect your Windows environment. And GlobalMantics, like I said, will use it. I'm going to go over to GM7075, and we're going to look at how you can configure user account control. Here we are. I'm going to go to the Start menu and choose Control Panel. At the towards the bottom of the list, I'll choose User Accounts, and I'll choose to change user account control settings. Now you'll notice I did not get prompt for UAC prompt. The reason is because I'm logged in as an administrator, and administrator is not subject to UAC in most cases. However, if I log off this machine, and then I log back in as Scott, when I go to the Start menu, User Accounts, it's going to say, hey, do you want to allow this guy to do this? And this is the screen you get. So continue, this is where it's prompting for credentials. The reason it's prompting for credential is because the user account named Scott does not have any administrative rights on this machine. If I allowed that account administrative rights, then I would get a screen that says, are you going to allow this action or not? So in this case, I have to actually provide credentials for an account that has administrative rights in order to be able to complete this action. You can see some details, except there's not a whole lot there. And yes. Now at this point, for this user account control settings are set to their highest level. And this is the case for non-administrators. So for non-administrators, the default is to when you make changes to Windows settings, or when programs try to install software or make changes to the computer, you're going to get notified. Here's the other setting we talked about. Always notify me and do not dim my desktop. And a number of other settings. Notice that permission got revoked as soon as I was done configuring user account control. So basically, UAC temporarily escalates privileges based on whatever you decide to do. In this case, I provided some credentials. However, as soon as I was done with the task and closed that tool that I was using to make those changes, the credentials were revoked, and so was the access. And when I want to do something again, then I have to verify myself all over again. Again, this is a very good thing. You want to make sure that you don't give carte blanche access accidentally to someone or unintentionally give them permanent authorization on something you didn't intend to do. So by revoking this access immediately is a good thing, even though it can be annoying at times and a little inconvenient. I'd rather trade this kind of inconvenience for cleaning spyware or having to deal with immediate disaster any day of the week. There are a number of policies that you can set with regard to user account control in Windows 7. You can set these via group policy at the domain level, or you can set them via local group policy or local security policy locally on a machine. The policies are available at Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Local Policies, Security Options. I'll show you how to configure these and the local group policy editor on Windows 7 using the gpedit.msc tool. And I'll show you the local security policy tool as well. For example, you can provide granular controls over UAC policies, such as configuring user account control to always require credentials instead of just an approval window. And we've already walked through some UAC related information, but we'll take a look at all of the user account control related policies that are available in Windows 7. I've logged back in as administrator, and I'm going to go Start, Run, gpedit.msc to start the local group policy editor. Again, if I was doing this at domain level, I'd see a similar screen, but I'd be able to attach this policy to particular items in Active Directory and enable and enforce these policies domain-wide. That's beyond the scope of this course, but we'll be working with the local group policy editor frequently. Now, I have to go to Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Local Policies, Security Options. Security Settings, Local Policies, Security Options. And towards the bottom of the list, you'll see a number of items related to user account control. Now, there's two items. Actually, in most cases, you'll notice that when we've looked at the local policy editor so far, a lot of them have been not defined. Well, this time they are. And this is by default. So take a look at these. User account control, behavior of the elevation prompt for administrators in admin approval mode. It'll prompt for consent for non-Windows binaries, or prompt for consent, or you can set it to prompt for credentials. Now, when it says prompt for consent for non-Windows binaries, notice there's a difference here. There's prompt for consent on the secure desktop, or just simply prompt for consent. You can choose to be more secure by prompting for consent on the secure desktop, but I generally leave those at the defaults. Or you can just elevate it without prompting for administrators. So for non-Windows binary, so anything that Windows is not doing, that some other program is doing, you're making sure that even administrators are prompted before something is allowed to happen, okay? So that's important to know. When Windows is doing something, it's just going to happen. But when you're trying to do something with a non-Windows binary or an executable file, you're going to be prompted to make sure you really want to do this. And that helps protect administrators from themselves as well. If you ever have a question on a group policy item, click the Explain tab at the top of the screen. And this is going to give you all of the information you ever wanted to know about that particular item. For example, you have these options to elevate without prompting. This allows privileged accounts to perform an operation that requires elevation without requiring any consent. And you should use this only in the most constrained environments. In other words, don't use it. It's not a good idea. Prompt for credentials on the secure desktop. Prompt for credentials on the secure desktop. And we did that before. Prompt for consent on the secure desktop. This is just going to say permit or deny. Prompt for credentials, prompt for consent, or prompt for consent for non-Windows binaries, which is the default. When an operation for a non-Microsoft application requires elevation, the user is prompted on the secure desktop to select either permit or deny. So with a normal item, you can choose to prompt for consent or prompt for consent on the secure desktop. In this case, you're only prompting for consent for non-Windows binaries, but it's going to always do so on the secure desktop, which is the default. Again, you've got the behavior of the escalation prompt or the elevation prompt for standard users. You can automatically deny all elevation requests, prompt for credentials on the secure desktop, or prompt for credentials. Admin approval mode for the built-in administrator account. Basically, what this says is that the built-in administrator account can run all applications with full administrator privileges without being prompted. So, what you saw before was I logged off GM7075 in order to be able to show you that there was an elevation that took place. That's because the default is for this item to be disabled. So the administrator account, the local administrator account, or the domain administrator account can do anything it pleases without having to be approved. By default, however, other users, including domain admins, will be prompted before other things take place, saying that there's going to be an escalation of privilege. Do you want to allow this action to take place if you enable this option? But if you wanted to have all administrators be able to run in admin approval mode, you could. And actually, it is enabled. What this means is for all administrators, this admin approval mode is enabled, which means that other administrators, with the exception of the administrator account itself, are required to consent to actions before their privileges are escalated. Now, another item that's important to understand is virtualizing the file and registry write failures. Older software used to write things directly to things like program files, well, they still do the program files, but to System32 and a number of other areas. However, Windows 7, those areas are more protected than they used to be to help protect the integrity of the system. So, by default, what happens is Windows 7 will redirect things trying to write to these locations to other locations in the file system and registry to protect the integrity of these protected areas of the system. So this is by default. If you disable this setting, applications that try to write data to these protected locations simply fail. So for compatibility purposes, it's good to keep this enabled, but if you have no older applications, you can safely disable this group policy. For the exam purposes, I do highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with user account control and the policy settings that are available for user account control. In order to keep information secure, many organizations prohibit the use of removable devices, such as flash drives that you buy at places like Walmart or Best Buy. These devices can basically siphon sensitive data off onto something that can be taken anywhere and everywhere and handed off to people like competitors or, worse yet, lost or whatever. This is almost as bad as losing a laptop in some cases. The information that's on one of these devices can sometimes be very damaging if it falls into the wrong hands or is misused. Or it can be used to create a PR nightmare where an organization loses tens of thousands or millions of records that have sensitive information. So a lot of organizations will say, we're not going to allow the use of removable devices. This is handled through group policy or local group policy. At Computer Configuration, Administrative Templates, System, Device Installation Restrictions. And there's an item there called Prevent Installation of Removable Devices. And we're going to go over to a Windows 7 machine right now so you can see that. So as you can see, we're going to go to Computer Configuration, Administrative Template, System, Device Installation, Device Installation Restrictions. And you're going to see one of the items here is Prevent Installation of Removable Devices. This will prevent Windows from installing removable devices. It's considered removable when the device driver that indicates the device is removable. So a USB device that's reported to be removable will not be allowed to be connected. Now, of course, you can have a device that doesn't work right or whatever. You're never going to have this 100%. But by enabling this policy, which is disabled by default, then you're able to take some additional steps to protect the integrity of the information in the organization. Next up is Credential Manager in Windows 7. When you visit various websites or you go to a server, a lot of times you're being asked to provide a Windows or a login username and password. Now you get this when you go to websites or remote desktop sessions. When you choose to remember these passwords and these usernames, they're stored in what's called the Windows Vault. There are a number of options or a number of things you can do when you get to the Credential Manager. You can back up the Windows Vault so that you can restore it later on if it gets lost or for some reason you are not able to use the items in the Windows Vault anymore. You can modify an existing stored credentials. Let's say you visit a website and you had to change the password and you didn't store that password in the Windows Vault at that time. You can go to the Windows Vault later through the Credential Manager and make that password change. you can manually add a new credential or you can remove an existing credential. Now, I want to mention one more time this backing up and restoring the Windows Vault. There are times when you will lose access to the Windows Vault. If you change your password through any means other than changing your password on your own. For example, suppose your Windows password, you forgot it, or a user forgot the password, and you have to reset that user's password manually, they're going to lose access to their Windows Vault. If they change their own password, they won't. This protects that person from some administrator being able to get all of their passwords to personal websites and all that good stuff by not providing access to the Windows Vault. It also means that they are not able to get access to their encrypted file system certificates anymore. So if you make a password change on behalf of a user, they lose access to their EFS-based shares unless you've taken other steps to make sure that they continue to have access to those shares after the password change. We'll be talking about the encrypted file system later on in this course. So the 5 things that you see in this list are things you can do via the Credential Manager. We're going to go over to a Windows 7 machine now, and we're going to take a look at the Credential Manager and see what you can do and what it looks like. Here we are over on GM7075. I'm going to go to the Start menu, Control Panel, Credential Manager. And you're going to see that there are 3 credentials already stored under Windows Credentials. We don't have anything else stored right now except this, which we're not going to worry about right now. I have credentials stored for the server called GM File, more credentials for Studio PC or Studio 7, and another set of Windows credentials for the system named TS-PC-7. When I click the credentials for TS-PC-7, you're going to see that the username I'm connecting as is TS-PC-7/Scott. This is the username I'm going to log in with. Here's the password, and the persistence is Enterprise. Now I can edit these credentials if I want to, which I'm not going to because they work. Or if I wanted to, I can remove these credentials from the vault so that they don't work anymore. I don't want to do that either. Now, what I want to show you is when I browse to TS-PC-7, I can't say that, / shared stuff, I'm not prompted for any credentials. Now, I will tell you that if you have the same credentials on 2 machines, the one you're on and the one you're connecting to, and you're connecting to the remote machine with the same username and password for the username you're currently logged in as to the local machine, those credentials will be simply passed to the remote machine. In this case, I don't have the same username and password for the administrator account that I'm logged in with on GM7075. What's happened is this stored credential that I have in the Credential Manager is being passed to this machine instead. So I don't actually have to worry about providing login information for that particular connection. As you can see, this is an automatic logon credential, so I don't have to actually do anything. Now I want to show you something else. I'm going to close Credential Manager. I'm going to start and choose Run, and I want to connect to another machine. I'm going to go to Hyper-V1 $C$. $C$ is an administrative share that you're going to find on every Windows machine. And it's the C drive on the Hyper-V machine that I'm using for this course. Well, I'm going to log in as administrator. And I'm going to provide my password. And I'm checking the box next to Remember My Credentials. And I'll click OK. And then pretty soon you'll get a box up. Oops. When I type the right password, pretty soon you'll get a box up that shows what's on the C drive for the Hyper-V server. Now, when I go to Credential Manager, you're going to see that there are 4 credentials stored. When I chose that I wanted to store that credential, it got written to the Credential Manager, and I was able to do what I wanted to do with it. This is a good thing. Now, I also mentioned that you're able to back up and restore your Windows Vault. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to back up my Vault, and I'm going to back this up to, that's a good place for it, Vault. And I'll click Save. And next. And it's going to say press Control-Alt-Delete to continue your backup on the secure desktop. So I'll do that. Now you want to protect your backup file with a password so that no one else can get your stuff. Because remember, all of your usernames and passwords that you've stored are in this file. And click Next. I'm going to go back to full screen now. And it says the backup was successful. If you save the backup on removable media, remove it and store it in a safe location. Well, I saved the backup right to the hard drive, which is not the best place to store it, because if the hard drive goes away, so does the Windows Vault. But for this demonstration purposes, that was fine. Now I'm going to remove some of these credentials. So I'm going to take this one, I'm going to remove it from the Vault. Do I really want to do this? Yeah. And I'll take this one and remove it from the Vault as well. And I'm going to add another Windows credential called non-existent server. It doesn't matter because then we're not going to use it. Okay. So I added this additional Windows credential. Okay, now remember, I backed up my Vault, then I added this, then I deleted those other credentials. Let's say that I deleted them by mistake, okay? And then I added this credential for a server that doesn't really exist. This is just for demonstration purposes. I'm now going to restore my Vault. So Vault, next. Type the password for the Vault. And it tells me my logon credentials have been restored. Well, let's go take a look at them. Well, I'm going to close it and go back in. Notice that I now have GM-File, Hyper-V, Studio 7, and TSPC back. Well, that non-exist one is gone. That's because when you restore the Vault, it overwrites the Vault. It doesn't do it. It doesn't merge the stored copy of the Vault with the running copy of the Vault. It actually completely overwrites the Vault with what was backed up. So you have to be kind of careful when you're doing a backup and restore of the Windows Vault. That's pretty important to understand so that you don't make a mistake and accidentally remove some things you've already added. There may be times when you need to run a program using a different user's credentials. For example, suppose you're not logged in as an administrator, but you need to run a program as an administrator and you can't use user access control for some reason. You can use the run as command line tool to do that. And if you look at the screen, you'll see the syntax. The command is run as /user domain /user program, and then any switches that you want to use. And these are 3 common switches that are used with run as. /no profile simply runs the command as the user, no questions asked. However, there may be a time when this program you're running has to interact with the user's files, and if those files are stored in EFS protected shares, the encrypting file system protected shares, or files, then you're going to have to load that user's profile in order to load the certificates that are necessary to access those EFS protected files. So, you've got to make sure that you're able to load the profile then. So you'll do run as user, domain user, program /switches, and put the switches part will be /profile. And then one of the other ones you should understand is save cred. This is going to save the credentials you're using under the context of the local administrator account. So the next time you go to run this program, those credentials will be saved inside the context of the administrator account on the machine that you're running the program on. Let's go over to our sample machine for Global Mantic and see this working. I've started a command prompt and I've executed, well not executed, I've typed the command run as /user :gm /Scott. It's going to run this program as Scott, Notepad. Now, before I do that, I want to go to Notepad. I'm just going to type in test. When I do a save as on this file, you're going to notice that it goes to, well, that's not where I want it to go to. I want it to go to the Documents folder. And let's save it. Now let's go find the exact location for this file. And there's that file that we just created, first test. Now, that is in the administrator folder because I'm logged in as administrator. Let's do it this time running in as Scott. I have to provide a password for the user. And I've got to type second test. And I'm going to save this file as second test. This time, we'll refresh, and it's not there, is it? Let's go to users, scott.gm, my documents. There's that second test file that we just created. So I've logged in, basically run this program as a user Scott, and that actually executes that entire program under the context of the Scott account rather than the administrator account. And when I saved the file, it actually saved it in the Scott folder rather than in the administrator folder. So that shows you that when you do a run as, it actually really does run in the context of that particular user account. Windows 7 includes a number of policies that are related to Windows 7 accounts and how they work on the system. There are also some user rights information that you should understand and how you can go about configuring these items in Windows 7. Account and password policies are available in the local group policy editor or in the main group policy editor on a Windows server at Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Account Policies. Among the configurable password policies are to enforce a password history. So that means that you're not allowed to use the last 8 passwords, for example, that you've used in the past. And this is good for making sure that your users change their password every so often and don't continue to go back and forth among just a couple of passwords. There's a maximum password age, so a lot of organizations will change their passwords every 30, 60, 90, or 120 days. Once the password hits that maximum age, the user is required to change that password. And then there's a minimum password age that says, hey, you know, this password has to be in use for at least a day or two before it can be changed again. This goes hand in hand with the password history. Before there was a minimum password age, users would change their password, say, 8 times to get back to the password that they liked. And they would be able to change it in succession. They would just go change the password within a couple of minutes, one after the other, until they got back to the password that they liked. And that really defeats the purpose of enforcing passwords and password histories. You can make sure the passwords meet complexity requirements. This means that a password has to have at least an uppercase character, a lowercase character, a number, and a symbol, and be of a particular length in order to be considered valid on a Windows machine. You can also have passwords stored using what's called reversible encryption. And this is to support some older programs that have to be able to see the password. This is not recommended to enforce or to configure, but it's available for backward compatibility reasons. In my opinion, you should never use passwords with reversible encryption because that means that something can read that password and get it and use it for other things. So I just wanted to show it here as an example of something you should not be doing. There are some other account lockout policies that go hand in hand with password policies. This includes the account lockout duration, the threshold, and resetting the account lockout. We'll go look at these in just a minute. Finally, there are user rights, and we're going to talk about those in a second. Let's go over and look at the account and password policies first. So we'll go start the group policy editor. Maximize the screen. Then we'll go to Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Account Policies. Inside Account Policies, you'll notice 2 folders. There's Password Policy, and there's Account Lockout Policy. Starting with Password Policy, you'll notice that right now, the default is that Windows is going to remember the last 24 passwords that were used. So that means that after 24 passwords have been changed, the user can go back and start using those passwords over again. The maximum password age by default is 42 days. I don't know why it's 42, but it just is. You can change this if you want to by enabling the policy. Or if you want to, you can set this so the passwords never expire by changing this to 0 days. I really don't know why the default is 42. That must be something that Microsoft researched and found that it was a good number. Minimum password age is 1 day. by default. Minimum password length is 7 characters. Password must meet complexity requirements is enabled. You're going to notice these are all grayed out. These are set by group policy at the domain level, so they're grayed out at the local level. And here's some information about what complexity requirements the password has to meet. It has to be at least 6 characters in length. Contain characters from 3 of the 4 categories, including the English uppercase characters, English lowercase characters, the base 10 digits, non-alphabetic characters, such as exclamation point, pound sign, percent, stuff like that. And again, by default, these policies are enabled on domain controllers. And when they're enabled on domain controllers, when you have the group policy enabled, it's going to be enabled across the domain, so you can't change them necessarily on a local machine. And storing passwords with reversible encryption is disabled. You then have some account lockout policies. The account lockout duration is not applicable, but this is the number of minutes a locked out account will remain locked out before it just becomes unlocked. If it's 0, the account is locked out until an administrator explicitly unlocks that account. So that means that if you've provided a wrong password for a number of times, or you've met that security threshold, then your account's going to be locked out until administrator allows you to log back in. The account lockout threshold says the number of failed logon attempts that cause a user account to be locked out. If you set the value to 0, the account's never locked out. This is set to 0 by default. And at the domain level, the administrator would need to change this to some number higher than that to enable the security lockout. You can also choose to basically have the account be automatically unlocked after a particular amount of time. If you choose 0 or you have none, that's because the setting is not applicable because you don't have an account lockout enabled for right now. However, you can change this from 1 minute to 99,999 minutes. So basically, if you set this to 10 minutes and you had the account lockout threshold set to 3 attempts, after 3 attempts, the user's account would be locked for 10 minutes, at which point it would automatically unlock. So those are the password and account policies that are available in Windows 7. There are also some user rights assignments that you should understand and make sure that they at least exist. For the exam, you're probably not going to be necessarily tested on individual user rights assignments, but I would highly recommend you go through them and make sure that you understand what they do and what they're for. There are more than 3 dozen user rights assignments policy settings, and we're going to go over and take a quick peek at them, but we're not going to spend that much time on them because they're not really all that applicable to the exam, and Global Mantix will not be using much in the way of user rights assignments in their own organization. But I want you to know that they exist and how to get to them. So back over on our sample machine we've been using in this lesson, and we've got to start the group policy editor again. And this time we're going to go to computer configuration, Windows settings, security settings, local policies, user rights assignment. And you're going to see that there's quite a few things here. There are a number of items here that you're only going to have to play with if you're specifically told to by tech support or some program installation instructions or what have you. Like I said, you're not going to have to worry too much about these on the exam, but you should understand that they do exist and at least know what's here. We'll take a look through these. You have access this computer from the network, everyone, administrators, user, backup operators. If you double click that, you'll get an explanation for exactly what this setting is about. This right determines which users and groups are allowed to connect to the computer over the network. This does not affect remote desktop services. Remember, remote desktop services has its own list of users that are allowed to connect to the system. And here's the defaults. Defaults on workstations are administrators, backup operators, users, and everyone. On domain controllers, it's more restricted, but here you go. Load and unload device drivers, administrators, who can dynamically load and unload device drivers or other code into the kernel mode. This does not apply to plug and play drivers, but this applies to what are called kernel mode drivers, which can affect system stability. And the local security setting says only administrators can do that. Removing a computer from a docking station, well, anybody should be able to do that. So yes, administrators, power users, and users can do that. Shut down the system. Administrators, users, and backup operators can shut down the system. So it's important to understand these rights exist. It's not that important that you know exactly what every single individual right is unless you're specifically told to understand what they are for a particular tech support reason. Windows 7 includes a number of local groups that are important to the proper operation of the system. These include the local administrators group, and administrators have complete and unrestricted access to the entire computer and domain. And as you can see, there are a number of groups that are available on a Windows 7 machine, including backup operators, the cryptographic operators, event log readers, those that read event logs, guests, IIS users, those that can read performance logs or performance monitor information, power users, remote desktop users, a number of different kinds of users. I'll go over to the Windows 7 machine we've been working with and show you how you can manipulate these user groups, but you should understand that these are the groups that are built into Windows 7 and understand what their function is. I'll also tell you that Global Mantix is not going to be doing too much with messing around with the local user groups, so it's not horribly important to Global Mantix, but for completeness of knowledge, I wanted to include it in this lesson. From the Start menu, right-click the computer and choose Manage. On the Management tool, go to Local Users and Groups and choose Users. And you're going to see the users that are here that are local. Remember, these are just the local users. And then you'll have the groups that we just talked about. Now notice here the home group doesn't exist. That's because we're on a work environment. On this machine from which I took the screenshot, it was a machine that was a member of a home group, so they were that group was listed here as well. And if you look at the remote desktop users group, you'll notice that there's a membership of Scott. Remember, earlier in this lesson on this machine, I gave access to the Scott user on this machine. So that user is a member of the remote desktop users group. Now, this also gives you another way that you can add remote desktop users a little bit more easily than you would necessarily be able to from the remote desktop tool that we saw earlier. If I wanted to add another user, I could simply click Add and then browse Active Directory for another user to add to this group. For the exam, you should understand what these groups are and what they do. For Global Mantix, it's not horribly important, however, except the remote desktop users group. Unfortunately for the help desk, users will forget their passwords from time to time. This is where the creation of a password reset disk can come in handy, because simply resetting a user's password for them has consequences. Namely, the user will lose access to their EFS encrypted files unless other steps have been taken. Those other steps we'll talk about later in this course. Any credentials that are stored in Credential Manager will no longer be accessible to that user. So those are two relatively significant consequences of resetting a password on behalf of a user because they've forgotten it. A password reset disk can be a floppy disk or a USB or removable device, and it can be used to reset a password without the aforementioned negative side effects. There's a huge caution here, though. Anyone that finds a password reset disk can use it. If they put the password disk in the machine and go ahead and try to reset the user's password, they will be able to do it. So that's a huge downside to the use of a password reset disk. You have to make sure you store this disk in a secure location unless you want to potentially suffer really horrible consequences of a password disk being lost. This time I've created a non-domain joined computer that we can use to test the creation of a password reset disk. I should clarify that you can only create a password reset disk for local users on non-domain joined computers. So for a domain environment, it doesn't really matter. But if an administrator has to reset a password in a local environment, then you're going to face those consequences that I mentioned earlier. For a domain environment, an administrator can reset your passwords. So I have logged into this non-domain joined computer. It's called, the work group is called work group. There's no domain. The full computer name is LocalDude PC, and I'm logged in as a user called LocalDude. Now, from this non-domain joined computer, I'll go to Start, Control Panel, User Accounts and Family Safety, and click User Accounts. You'll notice over here at the left-hand side of the screen that I have an option to create a password reset disk. And when I choose that option, it starts a wizard, Forgotten Password Wizard. On the first screen, I'll simply click Next. Before I do that, anyone can use the disk to reset the password and therefore have access to this account. A lot of small businesses that don't use domains may want to use the Forgotten Password, create a password reset disk for their administrator account. So just in case they forget the password to their all-important administrator account, that they have this password reset disk available. If they do that, make sure that this disk is stored in a very secure location. I want to create a password key disk on the following disk, drive A, that's all I've got available. Current user account password, I've got to provide the password. And you're going to see that the wizard creates the disk. It's 100% complete. And then I've got to discard any previous disks since they can no longer be used. Label the disk password reset and keep it in a safe place. That's all there is to using a password reset disk. If you ever have to reset your computer, if you forget your password, you'll have to go through the recovery process. Now, let's say that you have forgotten your password and you type in something that's wrong. Now, eventually, you're going to get a password hint. I don't have a password hint. I've always typed none for password hints. Or you can click the Reset Password link. If you forgot the password for this user account and you're unable to log in, this wizard will help you reset the password. But you must have first created a password reset disk. So we'll click Next. The password key disk is in the following drive. I've placed the floppy disk in the A drive again. And I'm going to type a new password. And I've typed my new password and provided a password hint, and I'll click Next. I've successfully reset my password for this user account. I can use the same disk to reset my password in the future. I don't need to update the disk. So, that's all there is to it. Now, I can log in with that new password that I created because I've reset the password using the password reset disk. We're going to wrap up this behemoth of a lesson by talking about understanding smart card policies. We won't actually implement any smart card policies, but we'll talk about what Windows 7 does with regard to smart cards. First of all, what are smart cards? Smart cards are devices that can be used to authenticate the systems. They're basically a physical device that you can connect to a system that will authenticate against the system, just like a username and password does when you type it on the keyboard. They're often considered more secure than typical username password-based authentication mechanisms because they're something you have. You could share that smart card with someone, but it's easier for you to share your username and password with someone than it is your smart card. So they're often considered more secure than just a username and password. They're often used to augment, not replace, username and password though. A lot of times you'll use this multi-factor authentication. You'll have to provide a username and password and use a smart card to log into a machine. Windows 7 uses what's called the Personal Identity Verification Standard from the National Institute of Standards and Technologies and includes some other new features, including smart card and BitLocker encryption via the use of a smart card, and you can use document email signing capability with a smart card in Windows 7. This was not available in older versions of Windows. Smart card policies are enabled through the use of group policy or the local group policy editor in Windows 7. And there are some policies you should at least understand that they exist. Does an interactive logon require a smart card? A simple yes or no. If you have an interactive smart card and you remove the smart card, let's say you've logged in and with a smart card, what happens when you pull that smart card out? No action as the default. Basically, the user just keeps going as if nothing happened. You can set it so the workstation locks. That means that as soon as the user pulls that smart card, it locks the workstation. Or it forces a log off, so rather than just locking the workstation, the user is completely logged off the machine. Or if the user is connected via a remote desktop services connection, the connection is disconnected. Let's go over to a Windows 7 machine and take a look at smart card policies. I've already started the group policy editor and gone to Windows settings, security settings, local policies, security options, in the computer configuration node. Again, these policies can also be configured from the domain-based group policy editor and attached to an Active Directory organizational unit for enforcement. But for now, we're interested in just looking at the policies. There are two policies we mentioned. One is the interactive logon requires smart card, and it's disabled by default because most organizations right now, well, a lot of organizations right now, don't require the use of smart cards, so it would be kind of crazy for it to be enabled by default. Then we have smart card removal behavior. We're going to either take no action, lock the workstation, force log off, or disconnect it if it's a remote services session. And if we go to the explanation tab, we can get some more information about exactly what happens in each of those cases. And again, that explanation tab is incredibly important as you're looking at local group policy and other group policy information. We covered quite a bit in this lesson. You learned how to configure user account control in order to obtain the best balance between security and flexibility, or security and usability. Then you learned about removable device policies and why they can be important to GlobalMantic. Next, we discussed a credential manager and how it can be used to store credentials for various systems. The run as command can be useful if you have to run a program under the context of a different user. Next, Windows 7 account policies and user rights in local groups were discussed, and then we've moved on to creating a password reset disk for machines not joined to a domain. We wrapped up this lesson with an understanding of smart card policies. If you've ever wondered about some of the inner workings of user account control secure desktop, which is what you see in the background when the desktop dims, here's a Vista explanation for how secure desktop works, and it's a very good explanation for why the secure desktop is so important. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.